The teenager caused quite a stir when she entered the courtroom on that frigid November morning in 1843. She was so young, so pretty, dressed in her fine clothes and bonnet, her face placid, almost devoid of emotion. Surely this sweet 16-year-old girl who spoke with an Irish lilt and held herself with such quiet detachment couldn't be guilty of the horrendous charges laid against her. And surely she had not come to trial wearing the clothes of the woman she was accused of murdering. Welcome back to Victorian True Crime, a series devoted to the sensational criminal cases that defined an era obsessed with civility, sin, and spectacle. Today, we're talking about the double murder that left 19th century Canada reeling and launched an enduring global fascination with an accused murderess who was as unnerving as she was unknowable. This is the story of Grace Marks. Anyone familiar with Margaret Atwood's 1996 novel Alias Grace, or the more recent Netflix series of the same name, will know that this case is a doozy. This story absolutely crawled under my skin when I watched the 2017 adaptation, and honestly, I haven't stopped thinking about it since. Grace Marks was born in the northern Irish province of Ulster in 1828, the third of 9 children. Her father was a stonemason and a barely functioning alcoholic who moved his family from Ireland to Canada in 1840. Sadly, Grace's mother did not survive the Atlantic Passage, and she was buried at sea, leaving Grace and her 8 siblings to carve out a new life with their abusive alcoholic father in a foreign land. Her father proved unable to support the large family, and at just 12 years old, Grace entered domestic service, joining the ranks of so many other poor immigrant girls whose prospects promised little more than a life of backbreaking work, minimal protection, and no real hope of social mobility. For the next 3 years, Grace served in the households of at least 4 well-to-do families before being poached from her penultimate employer by a woman named Nancy Montgomery. Nancy was an attractive young housekeeper at the home of Thomas Kinnear, a wealthy Scotsman and a gentleman farmer. Kinnear had been looking to bulk up his household staff, and so Nancy hired Grace to come on as maid. In early July of 1843, just days after her 16th birthday, Grace took up her new post at Kinnear's house in Richmond Hill, about 16 miles outside of Toronto. Aside from Nancy, there was also a male servant in residence, a 20-year-old groom named James McDermott. McDermott was also new to the Kinnear household, having been hired only a week before Grace. James was known for being moody, hot-tempered, and careless in his work, and he and Nancy had started butting heads almost from the beginning. Nancy frequently scolded the young man for his poor work performance and insolent attitude. James resented being bossed around by Nancy, who lorded about Kinnear's household as if it were her own. And in a certain sense, it was. You see, Nancy Montgomery wasn't only Kinnear's housekeeper. It was the worst-kept secret in town that she was in a romantic relationship with her employer. In fact, the two had been living together as common-law man and wife for years. And though this somewhat scandalous arrangement meant that Nancy was largely shunned from polite society, she and Kinnear seemed genuinely happy, content to share their quiet, unconventional life together outside of Toronto's well-to-do social circles. James apparently resented her for this as well, often complaining about having to take orders from a whore. According to Grace's later testimony, the first 2 weeks of her employment at Kinnear's house were quiet and uneventful. And though she too seemed to find Nancy a bit bossy, fussy, and domineering, Grace at least appeared to have a less fractious relationship with the housekeeper than James did. McDermott had not even been employed at the house for 3 weeks before it became clear to everyone that the situation was not going to work out. In mid-July, Nancy informed James that he could work until the end of the month, after which he would be dismissed. And that, Nancy thought, was the end of that. Fast forward to Saturday, July 29th, 1843. Thomas Kinnear was on his way back home after a few days in Toronto when he met a friend on the road and invited him to call at the house the following morning. When the friend arrived on Sunday the 30th, he found Kinnear's house unusually quiet. There seemed to be no servants about, and his knocks at the doors and windows continued to go unanswered. Increasingly concerned, the friend rounded up a few others, and the little group broke in to search the house. It was immediately clear that something was wrong. The house had been turned upside down. There were objects strewn about the floor, drawers emptied, valuables and other items clearly missing. But this was nothing to what they found in the cellar. There was Kinnear, lying out in the open, splayed on the floor of the cellar with a gunshot wound to the heart. Nancy was found hidden beneath a tub, an axe wound to her head, and a handkerchief tied tight around her neck. And Kinnear's 2 young servants were nowhere to be found. It was fairly clear to everyone what had happened, and police at once set off in pursuit of the missing maid and manservant. They traced the pair to Toronto, from whence they appeared to have entered the United States. Authorities finally caught up with them in Lewiston, New York. The two were traveling under assumed names, and were found in possession of Kinnear's cash and much of the missing property from the house. The arrest of the 2 murderous servants set off a media firestorm. Each blamed the other for the horrid crime of which they were both accused. Though she did confess to assisting James and to stealing the household valuables, Grace insisted that she had taken no part in the murders themselves, that her assistants had been coerced by James, who had threatened to kill her if she did not cooperate. She had reluctantly fled with him, but at Lewiston, she claimed to have dug in her heels, protesting that she would go no further. James confessed to murdering Kinnear and Nancy, but he insisted that Grace was the mastermind behind the whole plot. that she had goaded and encouraged him to kill their employers, then flee to the States where the two would be married. The trial of Grace Marks and James McDermott caused a media sensation. Riddled with drama, gore, hierarchical struggles, and hints of illicit sexuality, the case became a cause célèbre. Crimes in which servants turned against their betters were always particularly unnerving for Victorian society, signaling an inversion of natural order. The fact that the slain lovers were not married and belonged to opposite ends of the class hierarchy only added to the intrigue, as did the revelation that Nancy Montgomery had been pregnant at the time of her murder. Grace Marks was an object of particular fascination. Bizarrely, she had showed up to court wearing the clothes that she had stolen from Nancy Montgomery. She displayed little emotion during the trial. She was too calm, too detached, too composed, traits that made many at the trial deeply uneasy. Newspapers couldn't get enough of her. They published descriptions of her sweet face and cold demeanor, and obsessed over her innocence or guilt. The Examiner newspaper observed that considerable interest in the trial was due in large part to, quote, some doubt whether the female prisoner had been a willing or reluctant participant in the murder. This was the question that hung like a shadow over the entire trial, and which continues to haunt and intrigue true crime fans to this day. How culpable was Grace Marks? Was she a manipulative teenage murderess or a traumatized accomplice? Some viewed her as a tragic child seduced by evil, others as a seeming temptress. Victorian society needed women to either be saints or monsters, and Grace refused to neatly conform to either role. Her status as a domestic servant made her a doubly unnerving figure. Contemporary newspapers emphasized the alarming subversion of order perpetuated by Marks and McDermott, who appear to have killed their employer with concerningly little provocation. James McDermott was easily convicted of first-degree murder, while Marks was convicted as an accessory before and after the fact. Both were sentenced to death. Here, Grace's stoicism cracked, and she fainted when her sentence was read. McDermott was hanged, but appeals for mercy on Grace's behalf resulted in her sentence being commuted to life imprisonment. She was incarcerated at Kingston Penitentiary, and her behavior behind bars only added to the mystery. Displaying signs of insanity, she was briefly committed to an asylum, but the doctors there were skeptical about the authenticity of her madness. After being returned to Kingston, Grace seemed to settle down. She worked hard. She converted to Methodism. She was described as polite, mild-mannered, docile even. And yet, those who met her in person often came away with the same reaction, that something about her was unreadable, just ever so slightly off. In 1872, after nearly 30 years in prison, Grace Marks was quietly pardoned and released. She disappeared from public life and from historical record. We don't know what became of her. We don't know whether she lived out her days under an assumed name or quietly left Canada altogether. To this day, Grace Marks remains as enigmatic as she seemed in 1843. Was she a manipulative mastermind or a pliable pawn? A cunning femme fatale or merely an impressionable innocent? The truth may lie somewhere in between these two extremes, but in all likelihood, we'll never know.